I stood at the church entrance, my heart pounding with pride as I adjusted my tie. $30,000 from my retirement fund had made Sarah's dream wedding possible. The cathedral sparkled with crystal chandeliers and white roses I'd personally chosen. 200 guests filled every pew, cameras ready to capture this perfect moment. Sarah looked breathtaking in her designer gown as she took my arm. "Ready, Dad," she whispered, and I nodded, my eyes already misty. We began walking down that pristine aisle, organ music filling the air. Then, halfway down, she stopped. Her grip on my arm loosened, and when she looked at me, her eyes were ice cold. "You're not my real father. Step aside." The church fell silent. Guests turned to stare. My legs nearly gave out, but she wasn't finished. Her voice echoed through the cathedral. "This man means nothing to me." I didn't argue or beg. I simply stepped back and watched my daughter continue alone. But what happened next would change everything, and they'd never see it coming. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. 25 years. That's how long I had dreamed of this moment. The cathedral stretched before us like something from a fairy tale, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadows above crystal chandeliers that cast warm, golden light across rows of polished wooden pews. 200 guests turned to watch as the massive oak doors swung open and the first notes of Pachelbel's canon filled the sacred space. Sarah stood beside me in the vestibule, her hand resting lightly on my arm. The $3,000 wedding dress I had bought her fit perfectly, its silk train pooling behind her like spilled moonlight. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, adorned with the pearl hairpins that had belonged to my grandmother. She looked radiant, beautiful, perfect. Everything I saw had been paid for with my retirement savings, the imported white roses cascading from every pew end, the crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen starbursts above our heads, the hand-carved altar where Father Martinez waited with a warm smile. $8,000 for catering, $5,000 for flowers, $4,000 for photography, $3,000 for that dress that made my daughter look like a princess. I had worked 60-hour weeks at the steel mill for 30 years to save for moments like this. Growing up, I was always the invisible child in my own family. My parents lavished attention and resources on my golden boy brother Marcus, while I became the family ATM from age 14, working part-time jobs to help pay bills nobody else seemed worried about. When I graduated high school with honors, they couldn't attend the ceremony because Marcus had a baseball game the same night. The pattern was set early. I existed to provide, not to be celebrated. But I had promised myself things would be different with Sarah. I would give her everything I never had. Love, attention, security, and yes, financial support without strings attached. From the moment she entered my life as a 6-month-old baby, she was my world. I tucked her into bed every night, taught her to ride a bike in our driveway, helped with homework at the kitchen table, and cheered loudly at every school play and soccer game. Margaret was only 19 when Sarah's biological father, David Morrison, walked out on them both. I was 22, working construction and living in a studio apartment, but I fell in love with both of them instantly. Within 6 months, I had legally adopted Sarah and changed her last name to Mitchell. I put her on my health insurance and started a college fund that same week. For 23 years, I was her father in every way that mattered. "Ready, princess?" I whispered, using the nickname I had called her since she was 3 years old. Sarah turned to look at me, and for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Something cold and calculating that I had never seen before. But then she smiled, the same radiant smile that had melted my heart for over 2 decades. "Ready, Dad?" The wedding march began. We stepped forward together, moving slowly down the aisle as guests rose to their feet. Cameras flashed, people smiled. Mrs. Henderson from next door dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. My co-workers from the mill nodded approvingly, knowing how hard I had worked to make this day perfect. This was the moment I had sacrificed everything for: the mortgage on my house to pay for the venue, my health insurance canceled to afford her dress, my father's vintage watch, the only thing I had left of him, sold to a pawn shop to pay for those crystal chandeliers. We reached the halfway point of the aisle, the same spot where every father and daughter paused for the photographer to capture that perfect moment. The church held its breath in anticipation. But Sarah suddenly stopped. The music continued playing, but she turned to face me in front of everyone. The warmth in her expression vanished completely, replaced by something cold and cruel that I didn't recognize. "You're not my real father," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cathedral. The guests gasped. The music faltered and stopped mid-note. 200 faces stared at us in shock, their expressions ranging from confusion to horror. "Step aside," Sarah continued, her words cutting through me like broken glass. "This man means nothing to me." I stood frozen in disbelief. 23 years of bedtime stories and birthday parties, of scraped knees and broken hearts I had helped heal, of proud moments and quiet sacrifices, all dismissed with 10 words that echoed off the stone walls like gunshots. The familiar feeling of being discarded, of being valued only for what I could provide, crashed over me like a cold wave. But this time, something was different. This time, the invisible child had grown up and learned to prepare for betrayal. Instead of breaking down or begging or demanding an explanation, I quietly stepped aside. The church remained silent as Sarah continued down the aisle alone, her silk train sweeping behind her like she was walking over my grave. Guests stood frozen, unsure whether to sit or leave or pretend this wasn't happening. But as I watched her reach the altar where Jake waited with his mouth hanging open in shock, a strange calm settled over me like a blanket. Sarah had no idea what she had just triggered. This moment of public humiliation was about to cost her everything. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, my hand steady despite the chaos in my heart. With steady fingers, I dialed the number I had memorized 3 months ago. "Hello, this is Robert Mitchell," I said quietly into the phone, my voice carrying just enough to be heard by nearby guests, but not loud enough to interrupt the awkward ceremony continuing at the altar. "Yes, I'd like to cancel all payments immediately. Account number 7749-2156. Authorization code Delta 77. The ceremony stumbled forward as Father Martinez tried to maintain some dignity in the chaos. Jake stood at the altar looking like a deer caught in headlights, clearly having no idea this was coming. Sarah faced him with her back to the congregation, probably hoping the moment would pass and everyone would forget what had just happened. But within minutes, I could see the wedding coordinator rushing towards Sarah from the side entrance, her clipboard clutched against her chest and panic written across her face. She moved quickly up the aisle, her high heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. She reached Sarah and whispered frantically in her ear, gesturing toward the back of the church where I could see vendors gathering near the entrance. Sarah's shoulders tensed visibly beneath her silk dress. Then came the catering manager, his face grim as he approached the altar with purposeful strides. Behind him, the florist appeared, followed by the photographer clutching his expensive camera equipment, then the musicians who had been playing from the balcony above. One by one, every vendor was demanding immediate payment as their transactions had been declined in real time. Sarah's face went white as the reality crashed over her like a cold wave. She turned slightly to look back at the congregation, her eyes searching desperately for someone who might help, but finding only confused and uncomfortable faces staring back at her. Jake fumbled through his wallet with shaking hands, trying to produce credit cards that might save the situation. But I knew exactly what he would find. Nothing. They had no money of their own, no savings, no backup plan. They had been counting on my generosity to carry them through this day and every day after, just like they always had. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, rising from my pew and facing the congregation. Every head turned toward me. The murmur of confused voices died instantly. Even Father Martinez paused mid-sentence and looked in my direction. "Since my daughter has made it clear that I mean nothing to her," I continued, my voice steady and clear, carrying easily through the cathedral's excellent acoustics, "I thought you should know the truth about this perfect wedding you're witnessing." Margaret shot up from the front pew, her face flushed with panic and embarrassment. "Robert, please, not here, not now." But I ignored her completely. This was my moment, and I had earned it through 23 years of sacrifice and love that had just been thrown back in my face. "Every single thing you see here," I gestured broadly at the cathedral around us, "from the flowers in your hands to the chair you're sitting on, was paid for with my retirement money. Money I saved working 60-hour weeks at the steel mill for 30 years. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a thick folder, its contents carefully organized and documented over months of preparation. Bank statements, receipts, invoices, all the paper trail of a man who had given everything for his family. $8,000 for catering, I announced, holding up the first receipt. $5,000 for flowers, $4,000 for photography, $3,000 for that dress she's wearing right now. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like waves hitting a shore. Some guests leaned forward in their seats, others covered their mouths in shock. Mrs. Henderson from next door actually gasped loud enough for everyone to hear. Sarah tried to interrupt from the altar, her voice cracking with desperation. "Dad, please, I can explain. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what, Sarah?" I asked, my voice cutting through her protests like a knife. "You didn't mean to humiliate the man who raised you? You didn't mean to dismiss 23 years of love and sacrifice in front of 200 people?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Jake had given up on his wallet and was standing there looking like he wanted to disappear into the marble floor. "Sarah hasn't contributed a single dollar to this wedding," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. "Neither has her mother, Margaret, who's been unemployed for 3 years while I worked double shifts to support this family. Neither has her fiancé, Jake, who owes $50,000 in student loans and lives in an apartment I pay rent for." The truth hung in the air like incense, heavy and impossible to ignore. I could see guests exchanging glances, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "I mortgaged my house to pay for this day," I announced, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "I canceled my health insurance to afford her dress. I sold my father's watch, the only thing I had left of him, to pay for those crystal chandeliers hanging above your heads." Several guests looked up at the chandeliers, perhaps seeing them differently now that they knew the true cost. Jake was edging toward the side exit, unable to face the financial reality crashing down around them. I noticed several guests tracking his movement with disgust written across their faces. "But here's what she didn't know," I said, my voice taking on a cold edge that surprised even me. "Every payment I made was structured as a loan, not a gift." I pulled out the legal documents, holding them high enough for everyone in the cathedral to see. The papers were thick, official, and absolutely binding. Legal documents, signed and notarized 3 months ago when Sarah begged me to help with her wedding expenses. She signed every page willingly, in the presence of a notary, with full understanding of the terms and consequences. The cathedral was so quiet, you could hear the candles flickering on the altar. Sarah's wedding dress rustled as she swayed slightly, the weight of my words hitting her like physical blows. "And according to our agreement," I continued, savoring each word, "if she ever publicly disowned me as her father, the entire amount becomes immediately due with 18% interest." I did the math aloud for everyone to hear, my voice carrying to every corner of the sacred space. $30,000 in wedding expenses, plus the $15,000 car I bought her for graduation, plus 2 years of apartment rent at $1,500 a month, plus accumulated interest and penalties. The numbers hung in the air like a death sentence. That's $47,400, payable within 30 days, or subject to immediate collection proceedings. Sarah's knees buckled slightly as vendors continued dismantling the reception around her. The fairy tale wedding was dissolving in real time, and she had no power to stop it. The folder in my hands contained more secrets, more evidence, more carefully planned surprises that would destroy any hope of escape they might be harboring. I opened it wider, revealing layers of documentation that told a story spanning years of systematic financial exploitation. Bank statements, credit card, bills, loan applications, transfer records, every piece of evidence carefully collected and organized over months of growing suspicion. "But the wedding is just the beginning," I announced to the stunned congregation, my voice echoing through the cathedral as vendors continued their hurried dismantling around us. This folder contains 3 years of financial records that tell a very interesting story. Sarah was gripping the altar rail now, her knuckles white against the polished wood. Jake had completely disappeared, probably already in his car, speeding away from the disaster his wedding day had become. I pulled out a bank statement from 18 months ago, holding it high enough for the front rows to see the highlighted transactions. "Here's a transfer for $2,000 to Sarah's account, marked as emergency car repair." Except there was no car repair. The money went to a weekend trip to Las Vegas with her friends. Gasps echoed through the cathedral. Mrs. Peterson, who had known Sarah since she was a child, shook her head in disappointment. "Here's another one," I continued, pulling out a second statement. $3,000 for a supposed medical bill that insurance wouldn't cover, except I called the doctor's office. There was no bill. The money went to pay off Jake's credit card debt. The evidence was overwhelming, each piece more damning than the last. I had spent months reconstructing the truth, following every dollar, checking every story they had told me. "And here's my personal favorite," I said, holding up a receipt from a jewelry store. $1,500 that Sarah said she needed for textbooks. Turned out to be an engagement ring for Jake. Paid for with my money, given to another man, while she lied to my face about studying for finals. The congregation was riveted now, unable to look away from the unfolding revelation. Some guests were taking pictures with their phones, capturing the moment when decades of deception came crashing down. Margaret tried to intervene from the front pew, her voice shaking with desperation. "Robert, please, this is neither the time nor the place for—" "When would be the right time, Margaret?" I asked, turning to face my wife of 24 years. "When you and Sarah had taken everything I owned and disappeared with David Morrison? When would have been convenient for you?" The mention of David's name sent another wave of shock through the guests. This was information most of them were hearing for the first time. "Oh yes," I continued, pulling out another set of documents. "Let's talk about David Morrison. Sarah's biological father, who abandoned her when she was 6 months old and conveniently reappeared in our lives 6 months ago." I held up phone records, text message transcripts, and bank statements that painted a picture of careful planning and cruel deception. Here are text messages between Sarah and David from 3 months ago. "Dad, Robert is such a fool," she wrote. "He actually thinks I love him. After the wedding, we can take everything, and he'll be too broken to fight back. The words hit me harder than I expected, even though I had read them dozens of times while preparing for this moment. 23 years of bedtime stories, birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, and father-daughter dances, all dismissed as the delusions of a fool. And here's David's response, I continued, my voice growing colder with each revelation. Once we humiliate him publicly, he'll be too destroyed to contest the divorce. Margaret gets the house, you get the cars and accounts, and I get my family back. Sarah was sobbing openly now, her carefully applied makeup running in dark streaks down her face. The $3,000 wedding dress that had cost me a month's salary was wrinkled and stained with tears. But my absolute favorite message, I said, scrolling through the evidence on my phone, is this one from Sarah to David. I can't wait to see his face when I tell him he's not my real father. He's been such a sucker all these years, thinking I actually cared about him. The cathedral fell into complete silence, except for the sound of Sarah's crying and the distant noise of vendors loading equipment into trucks outside. I pulled out another document, this one thick and official-looking with multiple signatures and a notary seal. You see, what my loving family didn't realize is that I've been documenting everything for months. Every suspicious phone call, every secret meeting, every lie about where money was going. I held up a private investigator's report, complete with photographs and detailed timelines. Did you know that Margaret has been meeting David at the Riverside Motel every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for the past 8 months? While I was working overtime to pay for this wedding, my wife was planning her escape with her high school sweetheart. Margaret's face went from flushed red to deathly pale in seconds. Several guests turned to stare at her with expressions of disgust and disapproval. Here are credit card statements showing expensive dinners and hotel rooms that I never authorized. Phone records proving daily contact between Margaret and David for over a year. Bank account access records showing Margaret checking our balances and transferring money to accounts I didn't know existed. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. Every angle covered, every lie exposed, every deception documented with the thoroughness of a man who had learned not to trust the people closest to him. And here, I said, pulling out the most devastating document of all, is a signed agreement between Margaret, Sarah, and David, outlining exactly how they planned to divide my assets after destroying my reputation and forcing me into a divorce. I read directly from the document, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of the betrayal it revealed. Margaret gets the house and half of all retirement accounts. Sarah gets both cars, the savings account, and any inheritance from my parents. David gets custody of Sarah and the satisfaction of reclaiming his family, and I get nothing except the humiliation of being discarded like trash after 24 years of marriage and 23 years of fatherhood. The plan was laid out in black and white, signed and dated, impossible to deny or explain away. The only problem with their perfect plan, I continued, my voice taking on a tone of grim satisfaction, is that they underestimated me. They thought I was just a dumb construction worker who wouldn't fight back. They thought I would roll over and let them take everything I had worked my entire life to build. I closed the folder and looked directly at Sarah, who was still clinging to the altar rail like it was the only thing keeping her upright. But I've been planning too. For months. And my plan was better than theirs because it was built on truth instead of lies, on evidence instead of deception. The cathedral was completely silent now except for the sound of my own voice echoing off the stone walls. Every loan agreement Sarah signed is legally binding. Every transfer of funds is documented. Every lie they told is recorded. Every secret meeting is photographed. Every plan they made is preserved in writing. I tucked the folder back into my jacket, the motion deliberate and final. And now, instead of them taking everything from me, they're going to lose everything they never actually owned in the first place. The weight of my words settled over the congregation like a heavy blanket. Sarah was no longer just humiliated, she was trapped. Margaret was no longer just embarrassed, she was exposed. David Morrison was no longer reclaiming his family. He was inheriting a financial and legal nightmare. But I wasn't finished revealing the full scope of my preparation. The final piece of evidence would destroy any remaining hope they had of escaping the consequences of their betrayal. "And Margaret," I called out, my voice cutting through her attempts to quietly slip toward the exit. "Since you were the architect of this elaborate plan to humiliate me, I thought our friends and family should know about your other little secrets." Margaret froze in the aisle, like a deer caught in headlights. Her face, which had been flushed with embarrassment, now drained of all color as she realized I knew far more than she had ever imagined. "For the past year," I announced to the remaining guests, my voice carrying clearly through the cathedral, "while I was working double shifts to pay for this wedding, my dear wife has been having an affair with David Morrison." The gasps that echoed off the stone walls were audible this time. Several elderly family members clutched their chests in shock. Mrs. Henderson from next door actually said, "Lord have mercy," loud enough for everyone to hear. That's right, everyone. This whole charade about Sarah's real father was orchestrated so Margaret could leave me after the wedding and run off with her high school sweetheart. They planned to stick me with all the bills and disappear into the sunset together. Margaret finally found her voice, but it came out as a desperate whisper that barely carried beyond the first few pews. "Robert, you don't understand. It's not what you think." "It's not what I think?" I asked, pulling out my phone and scrolling to the evidence I had been saving for this moment. "Then explain this text message from you to David from last Tuesday." I read aloud, my voice steady and clear. "Robert is so excited about the wedding. He has no idea what's coming. After Saturday, we'll finally be free to be together like we should have been all along." The remaining guests were completely riveted now, unable to leave despite the uncomfortable situation unfolding before them. This was better than any soap opera they had ever watched, and it was happening right in front of them. "And here's David's response," continued, scrolling down on my phone. "Once we humiliate him publicly, he'll be too broken to fight the divorce. Sarah gets the house, you get the retirement accounts, and I get my family back. It's perfect." Margaret tried to deny it, her voice rising to a panicked shriek. "Those messages are fake." "He's making this up. Robert has always been jealous and controlling, but I had more evidence than she could possibly explain away." "Here's another one," I said, holding up the phone so the front rows could see the screen. "This one's from 3 weeks ago. I can't wait to see his face when Sarah destroys him at the altar. 24 years of marriage, and he still thinks I love him. What a pathetic fool." The words hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating everything they touched. Margaret's attempt at damage control was falling apart with each revelation. "And my personal favorite," I continued, savoring each word like fine wine, "is this voice message you left David yesterday morning while I was at work paying for your daughter's wedding flowers." I played the audio message, Margaret's voice echoing through the cathedral speakers with crystal clarity. "I'm so nervous about tomorrow, but also excited. After Robert gets humiliated, we can finally be together openly. Sarah and I have been planning this for months. He's going to be so destroyed that he won't even fight the divorce. Then we can take everything and start over like we always dreamed." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stood in the aisle with her mouth hanging open, unable to deny evidence that was literally her own voice confirming every accusation I had made. Sarah tried one last desperate intervention from the altar. "Dad, please, we can work this out. We can explain everything. It's not as bad as it sounds." "It's not as bad as it sounds?" I asked, turning to face my daughter for the final confrontation. "Sarah, you literally called me a pathetic fool in text messages to the man who abandoned you as a baby. You planned my public humiliation for months. You signed agreements to steal everything I own. How exactly is it not as bad as it sounds?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The trap was complete, built from their own greed and arrogance, constructed with evidence they had provided through their own careless communications. The beautiful part, I continued, addressing the entire congregation now, is that they documented everything themselves. Every cruel plan, every heartless scheme, every calculated betrayal, all preserved forever in text messages, emails, and recorded phone calls that they never thought I would see. I pulled out one final document from my jacket, this one bearing multiple official seals and signatures. Which brings me to the restraining orders I filed this morning, before the ceremony. Margaret and Sarah are now legally prohibited from accessing any of our joint accounts, selling any jointly owned property, or attempting to liquidate any assets we own together. Margaret's face went from pale to gray as the full implications hit her. You're also both prohibited from entering our house as of midnight tonight. Your personal belongings will be placed on the front lawn tomorrow morning. Everything else stays with me. The plan was falling apart faster than they could process it. 24 hours ago, they thought they were about to humiliate me and take everything I owned. Now they were facing financial ruin and legal consequences they had never imagined possible. But I had one more surprise that would complete their destruction. The final piece of this puzzle, I announced, reaching into my jacket one last time, involves someone who should have been here today but chose to hide like a coward instead. I pulled out a photograph, holding it high enough for everyone to see. It showed David Morrison entering a motel room with Margaret, time-stamped just 3 days ago. David Morrison, Sarah's so-called real father, is currently sitting in his car in the parking lot outside. He was supposed to be my replacement in this ceremony, but apparently he doesn't have the courage to face the consequences of his actions. Several guests turned toward the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the man who had orchestrated this elaborate betrayal. So let me share some interesting facts about your real father, Sarah. The man you've chosen over the one who raised you for 23 years. I consulted the folder again, pulling out a background check report that painted a devastating picture. David Morrison has been married 3 times since he abandoned you. He currently owes $47,000 in back child support to 2 different women. He's been evicted from 4 apartments in the past 2 years. His current income is 0 because he was fired from his last job for embezzling from his employer. Sarah's face crumbled as the reality of her choice became clear. She had traded a father who sacrificed everything for her for a man who had never supported anyone in his entire adult life. He's also facing criminal charges in Nevada for fraud and identity theft. Did he mention that when he was convincing you to destroy your relationship with me? The silence in the cathedral was complete now. Even the vendors had stopped their work to listen to the devastating revelations. But here's the most beautiful part of this whole situation, I continued, my voice taking on a tone of cold satisfaction. David Morrison has no legal standing whatsoever. He signed away all parental rights when Sarah was 1 year old. I have the court documents. I held up the official papers, yellowed with age but still perfectly legal and binding. Which means he has no claim to custody, no right to make decisions about Sarah's welfare, and absolutely no legal protection from the consequences of this conspiracy. Margaret tried one last desperate intervention. Robert, please, we can work this out. We're still married. We can go to counseling. We can fix this. Fix this? I asked, turning to face the woman I had loved for 24 years. Margaret, you spent a year planning to destroy me. You documented your hatred in text messages. You conspired with a criminal to steal everything I own. What exactly is there to fix? I pulled out another set of documents, these bearing the seal of the county courthouse. These are divorce papers filed yesterday morning. I'm citing adultery, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. Based on the evidence I've collected, you won't get a penny in the settlement. Margaret's knees gave out. and she collapsed into a nearby pew, the full weight of her situation finally hitting her. She had gambled everything on a plan that was now destroying her instead of me. "And Sarah," I said, addressing my daughter for what I knew would be the last time, "since you've made it clear that I'm not your real father, I'm legally disclaiming any future financial responsibility for your welfare. No more rent payments, no more car payments, no more credit card bailouts. You're officially David Morrison's problem now." I walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing off the marble floor like a funeral march. But I paused at the door and turned back to address the congregation one final time. "To everyone who witnessed this spectacle, I want you to understand something. I didn't plan this for revenge. I planned it for justice. For 23 years, I gave everything I had to people who saw me as nothing more than a wallet. Today, they finally showed their true colors in front of everyone who matters." I looked directly at Sarah, who was still clinging to the altar rail like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "You wanted your real father, Sarah? You've got him. Good luck collecting child support from a man who owes $47,000 to other children he abandoned." Margaret tried to call out to me as I reached the door, her voice breaking with desperation. "Robert, please! We can fix this! I'll leave David! We can start over!" But I was already walking out into the sunlight, pulling out my cell phone to make the call I had been planning for months. "Patricia?" I said when my lawyer answered on the first ring. "It's Robert." Everything went exactly as planned. Yes, I have video of the entire confrontation. They walked right into every trap we set. I got into my truck and drove directly to Patricia Williams' law office, where she was waiting for me with a stack of papers ready to file. We had been preparing for this moment for 3 months, ever since I first hired a private investigator to confirm my suspicions about Margaret's affair. "How do you feel?" Patricia asked, as I settled into the leather chair across from her desk. "Like a man who just escaped from prison," I replied honestly. "For the first time in decades, I'm free from people who only valued me for what I could provide." We spent the next 3 hours filing paperwork that would change 3 lives forever, the divorce petition citing adultery and financial fraud, the debt collection notices for Sarah's loans with detailed payment schedules and penalties, the eviction proceedings for the apartment I had co-signed, the repossession order for the car I had bought her. But the most satisfying document was the restraining order that would prevent Margaret, Sarah, and David from accessing any of my financial accounts or attempting to sell any assets we owned jointly. They were effectively frozen out of everything they had been planning to steal. "They'll try to fight this," Patricia warned me as we reviewed the final documents. "Expect them to claim emotional distress, undue influence, maybe even elder abuse. They'll say you coerced Sarah into signing those loan agreements." "Let them try," I replied, pulling out the thick folder of evidence I had been collecting for months. I have recorded phone conversations, text messages, emails, witness statements, and video, documentation of their entire conspiracy. Patricia nodded approvingly as she flipped through the evidence. Bank records showing suspicious transfers, credit card statements revealing expensive dinners and hotel rooms, phone records proving daily contact between Margaret and David for over a year, audio recordings of them planning my humiliation. "This is some of the most thorough documentation I've ever seen in a family law case," she admitted. "They don't have a legal leg to stand on." By 6 o'clock that evening, all the paperwork had been filed with the court. Sarah had 30 days to pay $47,400 or face garnishment of any wages or assets she might have. Margaret had been served with divorce papers that would leave her with nothing but her personal belongings. David Morrison was about to discover that his grand plan to reclaim his family had backfired more spectacularly than he could have imagined. My phone continued buzzing with calls and text messages from Margaret and Sarah, but I had changed my number that morning and given the new one only to Patricia and a few trusted friends. That night, I sat in my living room with a glass of whiskey and looked around at the house I had worked 30 years to buy. Tomorrow, I would start changing the locks. Next week, I would start planning the rest of my life. For the first time in decades, I would be living for myself instead of for people who saw me as nothing more than a source of money they were entitled to take. Word spread through our small town faster than wildfire in August. By Sunday morning, everyone within a 20-mile radius knew what had happened at St. Mary's Cathedral. The story had legs, and it was running hard. Mrs. Henderson from next door was the first to stop by, arriving at my front door at 8 a.m. sharp with a covered casserole dish and a sympathetic expression that told me she had already heard everything. "Robert, honey," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like she belonged there. "I've been watching this family for 15 years, and I always wondered why you worked so hard for people who never seemed grateful. Now I finally understand what was really going on." By noon, 3 more neighbors had stopped by to offer their support. Tom Jenkins from across the street showed up with a 6-pack of beer and a firm handshake that lasted longer than usual. "Man," he said, shaking his head in amazement, "I've never seen anyone handle betrayal with such class. You didn't yell, didn't make a scene, didn't lose your temper. You just let the facts speak for themselves. That was masterful." Carol Martinez from 2 blocks over brought her teenage daughter with her, using my situation as a teaching moment about character and integrity. "This is what real strength looks like," she told her daughter while gesturing toward me. "When people try to destroy you, you don't sink to their level. You rise above it and let the truth do the work." The local newspaper picked up the story by Tuesday morning. The headline read, "Local Father's Silent Revenge Shocks Wedding Guests." The article painted me as the devoted father who was publicly humiliated after sacrificing everything for his ungrateful family, then methodically dismantled their conspiracy with legal precision. "I've known Robert Mitchell for 20 years, my former supervisor at the steel mill told the reporter. "He's the most honest, hard-working man I've ever met. He never missed a day of work, never complained about overtime, never asked for special treatment. What his family did to him was despicable, but the way he handled it was brilliant." Social media exploded with comments supporting my actions. The newspaper's Facebook post had been shared over 3,000 times by Wednesday, with people calling me a hero for standing up to financial abuse and family exploitation. The hashtag #Justice for Robert was trending locally by Thursday morning, with strangers sharing their own stories of being taken advantage of by family members who saw them as ATMs rather than human beings. But the court of public opinion was absolutely brutal to Margaret, Sarah, and David Morrison. Former friends crossed the street to avoid them when they appeared in town. The grocery store clerk, who had known our family for years, gave Margaret the coldest shoulder imaginable when she tried to make small talk while buying milk. Sarah's co-workers at the dental office where she worked part-time had all seen the news coverage and were whispering behind her back every time she walked through the break room. Dr. Peterson, her boss, called her into his office on Wednesday to discuss whether her personal situation was affecting the practice's reputation. David Morrison, who had been staying at the Riverside Motel while planning his grand family reunion, found himself completely unwelcome everywhere he went. The bartender at Murphy's Tavern refused to serve him after recognizing his face from the newspaper photo. "We don't serve deadbeat dads who abandon their kids for 23 years and then come back to destroy families," he announced loudly enough for the entire bar to hear. "Take your business somewhere else." Margaret tried desperately to control the narrative by calling our mutual friends and claiming I had been emotionally abusive for years, that I was controlling and manipulative, that the whole situation was more complicated than it appeared. But nobody was buying her revisionist history. Too many people had witnessed my generosity and kindness over the decades. They had seen me work double shifts to pay for Sarah's education, sacrifice my own needs to provide for my family, never raise my voice or show anger even when I was clearly being taken advantage of. "Margaret's trying to rewrite 24 years of history," said Linda Peterson, who had been Margaret's closest friend until the affair was exposed. "I remember when Robert adopted Sarah and how happy Margaret was to have found a man who would love them both unconditionally. She's just embarrassed that she got caught cheating and planning to steal everything he owned." The pressure was immense and relentless. Their reputation was completely destroyed, while mine was not just vindicated, but elevated. People who had never paid much attention to me before were now stopping me on the street to shake my hand and express their admiration for how I had handled the situation. "You showed real class," said Father Martinez when I ran into him at the grocery store. "In 30 years of ministry, I've seen a lot of family betrayals, but I've never seen someone respond with such dignity and strategic thinking. You should be proud of yourself." By Friday, Margaret and Sarah were effectively social outcasts in a town where reputation mattered more than money. They couldn't show their faces anywhere without encountering disapproving stares and whispered comments about loyalty and gratitude. David Morrison packed his bags and left town without saying goodbye to anyone, realizing that his dream of reclaiming his family had become a nightmare of public humiliation and financial liability. The community had spoken with one voice, and their verdict was unanimous. Robert Mitchell was the victim who had finally gotten justice, and his family had received exactly what they deserved. 3 weeks after the wedding disaster, Sarah's court-appointed attorney filed a motion to invalidate the loan agreements, claiming I had coerced her into signing them under emotional duress and undue influence. The hearing was scheduled for a rainy Thursday morning in Judge Elizabeth Parker's courtroom. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through the legal community about the case, and several law students had come to observe what their professors were calling a master class in evidence preservation and strategic planning. Local reporters filled the back rows, their cameras ready to capture what everyone expected to be a dramatic conclusion to the most talked-about family dispute in county history. Sarah sat at the defendant's table with her court-appointed lawyer, Michael Stevens, a young public defender who looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. She wore a simple black dress that couldn't have cost more than $50, a stark contrast to the $3,000 wedding gown she had worn 3 weeks earlier. Margaret sat in the gallery behind Sarah, her face gaunt and hollow from weeks of stress and social isolation. David Morrison was notably absent, having fled town the previous week when he realized the legal and financial mess he had walked into. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Patricia Williams, who had spent the morning arranging our evidence in neat stacks that told the story of systematic deception and calculated betrayal. She wore her best navy suit and the confident expression of a lawyer who knew she held all the winning cards. Judge Parker entered the courtroom precisely at 9 a.m., her black robes flowing behind her as she took her seat at the bench. At 62 years old, she had a reputation for no-nonsense proceedings and zero tolerance for legal games or emotional manipulation. "We're here today," Judge Parker announced, "to determine the validity of loan agreements between Robert Mitchell and Sarah Mitchell, and whether those agreements were entered into under duress or undue influence. Mr. Stevens, you may present your opening argument." Sarah's lawyer stood up nervously, consulting his notes before addressing the court. "Your Honor, my client was emotionally manipulated by a controlling stepfather who used financial pressure to force her into signing agreements she didn't fully understand. Mr. Mitchell took advantage of his position as the family breadwinner to coerce a young woman who was dependent on him for survival. It was a reasonable strategy, I had to admit. Paint me as the abusive authority figure and Sarah as the innocent victim who had no choice but to sign whatever I put in front of her. Furthermore, Stevens continued, these so-called loans were presented as gifts for years. My client had every reason to believe that her stepfather's support was unconditional, as it had been throughout her entire life. The sudden revelation that everything was structured as debt represents a fundamental breach of trust and parental duty. He sat down, looking pleased with himself, probably thinking he had established reasonable doubt about my motives and methods. Patricia stood up with the calm confidence of a surgeon about to perform a routine operation. She had been practicing family law for 35 years, and this case was exactly the kind she lived for. "Your Honor," she began, "the evidence will show that every agreement was signed voluntarily, with full disclosure, in the presence of a notary, and with explicit discussion of terms and consequences. My client didn't manipulate anyone. He simply protected himself from people who had been systematically defrauding him for years." She gestured to our evidence table, which looked like a small library of documentation. "We have video recordings of the signing sessions, audio transcripts of conversations where terms were explicitly discussed, text messages from Miss Mitchell acknowledging her understanding of the loan structure. And most importantly, we have evidence of a conspiracy to defraud my client that was planned and executed over many months." Judge Parker looked intrigued. "Conspiracy to defraud?" "That's a serious allegation, Miss Williams. Indeed it is, Your Honor. And the evidence supporting it is overwhelming." Patricia approached the evidence table and selected a thick folder marked Exhibit A. "Your Honor, I'd like to present text messages recovered from Ms. Mitchell's phone, sent to David Morrison over a period of 6 months, detailing their plan to publicly humiliate my client and steal his assets." She handed copies to the judge and to Stevens, then began reading aloud. "March 15th, Sarah Mitchell to David Morrison. Dad Robert is such a fool. He actually thinks I love him. After the wedding, we can take everything and he'll be too broken to fight back." Sarah's face went white, as her own words were read in open court. "March 22nd, Sarah Mitchell to David Morrison. I can't wait to see his face when I tell him he's not my real father. He's been such a sucker all these years, thinking I actually cared about him." Stevens objected. "Your Honor, these messages are taken out of context and don't speak to the validity of the loan agreements." "Overruled," Judge Parker said firmly. "They speak directly to the plaintiff's state of mind and the defendant's credibility." "Continue, Ms. Williams." Patricia smiled and selected another document. "Your Honor, I'd also like to present recorded phone conversations between Margaret Mitchell and David Morrison, discussing their plan to destroy my client's reputation and divide his assets among themselves." She played an audio clip that filled the courtroom with Margaret's voice, crystal clear and undeniably incriminating. "I can't wait until Robert gets humiliated at the wedding. After Sarah destroys him publicly, we can finally be together openly. He's going to be so broken that he won't even fight the divorce. Then we can take everything and start over like we always dreamed." The courtroom buzzed with whispered comments from the spectators. Judge Parker banged her gavel for silence. Stevens was starting to look desperate. "Your Honor, even if there was some personal animosity, that doesn't invalidate my client's claim that the loan agreements were signed under duress." "Actually, Mr. Stevens," Patricia replied, "it does exactly that, because we have video evidence of every signing session, showing your client reviewing the documents carefully, asking questions, and explicitly acknowledging her understanding of the terms." She approached the judge's bench with a tablet computer. "Your Honor, this video shows Ms. Mitchell signing the wedding expense agreement on January 15th. She spent 45 minutes reviewing the documents with the notary, asked multiple questions about interest rates and default conditions, and explicitly stated on camera that she understood she was entering into a binding loan agreement." Judge Parker watched the video with growing amazement. On screen, Sarah appeared calm, competent, and fully aware of what she was doing. She even joked with the notary about being responsible with money for the first time in her life. "Furthermore," Patricia continued, We have bank records showing that Ms. Mitchell used the loan proceeds exactly as specified in the agreements, with full knowledge that the money was borrowed, not gifted. She presented another stack of documents. Credit card statements showing purchases made with the loan money. Text messages to friends bragging about the deal she had negotiated with her stepfather. Email confirmations of payments made with full awareness that they were being tracked and documented. Stevens was running out of ammunition. Your Honor, my client was young and inexperienced in financial matters. She trusted a father figure who took advantage of her naivety. Judge Parker looked at him with barely concealed contempt. Mr. Stevens, your client is 23 years old, college-educated, and employed. At what age do you suggest people become responsible for contracts they sign? Patricia moved in for the final blow. Your Honor, I'd like to present one more piece of evidence that conclusively demonstrates my client's innocence and the defendant's guilt. She approached the bench with a final document. This is a signed agreement between Margaret Mitchell, Sarah Mitchell, and David Morrison, outlining exactly how they planned to divide my client's assets after destroying his reputation and forcing him into a bankruptcy and divorce. The courtroom fell completely silent as Judge Parker read the document, her expression growing darker with each paragraph. This agreement, Patricia continued, was signed 2 weeks before the wedding. It specifies that Margaret gets the house and retirement accounts, Sarah gets the cars and savings, and David gets custody and control. It also includes detailed timelines for the public humiliation, the divorce proceedings, and the asset distribution. Judge Parker looked up from the document with an expression of disgust. Miss Mitchell, she said, addressing Sarah directly, you're telling this court that you signed loan agreements under duress, while simultaneously planning to steal everything your stepfather owned through fraud and conspiracy. Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. Mr. Stevens, Judge Parker continued, your client is not a victim of financial abuse. She's a perpetrator of it. These loan agreements are valid, binding, and enforceable. Furthermore, I'm referring this case to the district attorney for investigation of possible criminal charges. She banged her gavel with finality. The motion to invalidate is denied. The debt stands as agreed. Miss Mitchell has 30 days to pay the full amount or face garnishment and asset seizure. This court is adjourned. As the gavel came down, Sarah collapsed into her chair, the weight of her defeat crushing any remaining hope she had of escaping the consequences of her betrayal. The battle was over, and justice had been served with cold, legal precision. Within 1 week of Judge Parker's ruling, the carefully constructed lives that Margaret and Sarah had built on my generosity came crashing down like a house of cards in a hurricane. Sarah was the first to fall. With no savings, no credit, and wages that barely covered basic living expenses, she had no way to pay the $47,400 the court had ordered. Her part-time job at the dental office paid $12 an hour for 20 hours a week. Even if she gave me every penny she earned, it would take her over 40 years to pay off the debt. Dr. Peterson called her into his office on Monday morning and delivered the news she had been dreading. Sarah, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to let you go. The publicity from your court case is affecting our practice. Patients are asking questions, and some are threatening to find a new dentist. I can't afford to lose clients over an employee's personal problems. By Tuesday, the repo man came for the Honda Civic I had bought her for graduation. Sarah watched from her apartment window as they loaded it onto a flatbed truck, taking away her last symbol of independence and mobility. By Wednesday, the eviction notice arrived. The landlord had no interest in negotiating payment plans or extensions. Sarah and Jake had 30 days to vacate the apartment I had been paying for, or face forcible removal by the sheriff's department. Jake lasted exactly 4 days after the court ruling before he packed his belongings and disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving only a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. "Sarah, I can't handle this anymore. The debt, the drama, the way people look at us. I'm sorry, but I need to start over somewhere else. Don't try to find me." Even her so-called friends abandoned her when the reality of her situation became clear. The college classmates who had enjoyed expensive dinners and vacation trips funded by my money suddenly had other plans when Sarah needed emotional support or practical help. Margaret's collapse was even more spectacular. The divorce proceeding moved through the courts like a freight train, with Patricia Williams methodically dismantling every attempt Margaret's lawyer made to claim community property or spousal support. The affair with David Morrison, documented in hundreds of text messages and photographs, eliminated any possibility of alimony under state law. Though, conspiracy to defraud me, preserved in audio recordings and written agreements, made her liable for punitive damages rather than entitled to financial support. "Mrs. Mitchell," Patricia explained to Margaret's attorney during a settlement conference, "your client planned and executed a conspiracy to steal my client's assets through fraud and public humiliation. She's lucky we're not pursuing criminal charges. She'll be leaving this marriage with her personal belongings and nothing else." The house we had shared for 15 years was awarded to me completely, along with all retirement accounts, savings, and investments. Margaret was given 60 days to remove her clothing and personal items, after which anything remaining would be donated to charity. By Friday, Margaret was living in a studio apartment on the wrong side of town, working as a cashier at a convenience store for minimum wage. The woman who had planned to steal my life savings and retire with her high school sweetheart was now struggling to pay for groceries and utilities. David Morrison had vanished completely, leaving town the day after the court ruling without saying goodbye to either Margaret or Sarah. His grand plan to reclaim his family had backfired so catastrophically that he fled like a criminal escaping a crime scene. The private investigator I had hired tracked him to a trailer park 3 states away, where he was living under a false name and working odd jobs for cash. The man who had promised Margaret and Sarah a better life was hiding from his own creditors and legal problems. But the most satisfying part of their collapse wasn't the financial ruin or social isolation. It was watching them finally understand the full scope of what they had lost. Sarah called me exactly 2 weeks after the court ruling, her voice broken and desperate. "Dad, please, I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I was confused and angry, and David convinced me that you didn't really love me. Can you ever forgive me? Can we work something out with the money?" I listened to her sob for several minutes before responding with the words I had been planning for weeks. "Sarah, you made your choice very publicly in front of 200 people. You said I meant nothing to you. You said I wasn't your real father. You planned to steal everything I owned and humiliate me in the process. Those weren't the actions of someone who was confused. Those were the actions of someone who showed their true character. But I love you," she whispered. "You're the only father I've ever known. I made a mistake." "Love?" I asked. "Sarah, I have text messages where you called me a fool and a sucker. I have recordings where you laughed about taking advantage of my feelings. That wasn't love. That was exploitation." I hung up the phone and blocked her number. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness, and some relationships aren't worth saving. Margaret tried a different approach, showing up at my workplace a month after the divorce was finalized. She wore the same dress she had worn on our first date 25 years earlier, a calculated attempt to trigger nostalgic emotions. "Robert," she said, "I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But we had 24 good years together. Doesn't that count for something? Can't we try again?" I looked at the woman I had loved for over 2 decades, the woman I had worked myself to exhaustion to provide for. the woman I had trusted with my heart and my future. "Margaret," I said quietly, "those 24 years weren't good for you. You spent them planning your escape and counting my money. The only mistake you made was getting caught." She left crying, and I never saw her again. Within 6 months, both Margaret and Sarah had filed for bankruptcy, unable to manage even their reduced circumstances without someone else paying their bills. The family that had planned to destroy me had destroyed themselves instead, and I felt nothing but relief that they were finally out of my life forever. 2 years have passed since that devastating Saturday in the cathedral, and I can honestly say they have been the best 2 years of my adult life. I used the recovered money from the loan repayments and divorce settlement to fulfill dreams I had postponed for decades while supporting an ungrateful family. The Swiss Alps in winter, where I learned to ski at 57 years old. The beaches of Thailand, where I spent a month reading books and learning to scuba dive. The ancient ruins of Greece, where I walked in the footsteps of philosophers and felt a peace I had never experienced before. Each destination reminded me that life was bigger than the betrayal I had endured, wider than the small world of family obligation and financial exploitation I had inhabited for so long. But the most meaningful change wasn't geographic. It was personal. I started a small consulting business, helping other people who had been financially exploited by their families. The letters I received were heartbreaking, but also empowering. Fathers who had been treated as ATMs by ungrateful children. Mothers who had sacrificed their retirement savings for adult children who showed no appreciation. Siblings who had been systematically robbed by relatives who saw family as an opportunity rather than a responsibility. "Your story gave me the courage to stand up for myself," wrote Linda from Ohio, whose daughter had stolen her identity to open credit cards. "I thought I was supposed to sacrifice everything for family, but you showed me that love shouldn't be a one-way transaction. I finally filed charges against my son for forging my signature on a loan," wrote Thomas from Florida. "He took $40,000 from my retirement account and spent it on a sports car. Your example taught me that enabling isn't love, it's destroying both of us." The consulting business grew into something I had never expected. I traveled around the country speaking at senior centers and community groups about financial elder abuse and family exploitation. The audiences were always packed with people who recognized their own stories in mine. But perhaps the most satisfying development was completely unexpected. Patricia Williams introduced me to Elena Rodriguez, a widow whose husband had left her substantial life insurance money that her 3 adult children were fighting over in court. She had hired Patricia to protect her assets from relatives who suddenly appeared when they learned about her inheritance. Elena was 54, a retired school teacher with a gentle smile and iron determination to not be anyone's victim. She had raised 3 children as a single mother after her husband died in a construction accident, working 2 jobs to put them through college. Now that she finally had financial security, they were circling like vultures, claiming she owed them for the sacrifices they had made growing up without a father. We met for coffee to discuss her legal strategy, but ended up talking for 4 hours about everything except money. She had a quick wit, a love of travel, and absolutely no tolerance for people who confused family relationships with business transactions. "I've seen what you did with your situation," she said over our second cup of coffee. "You didn't let them make you bitter. You turned your pain into purpose. That takes real strength. We've been together for 18 months now, and she's everything Margaret never was." Elena appreciates kindness without expecting it. She contributes equally to our relationship without keeping score. She supports my consulting work because she understands the importance of helping people protect themselves from exploitation. Most importantly, she chose to be with me because she enjoys my company, not because she needs my money. We bought a small house together in the mountains of North Carolina, far from the town where I spent 24 years being taken for granted. Elena sold her house in Texas. I sold the house in Ohio that held too many painful memories, and we started fresh in a place where nobody knew our histories. The house has a wraparound porch where we drink coffee every morning and watch the sun rise over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Elena tends a vegetable garden that produces more tomatoes and peppers than two people could ever eat. I built a workshop in the garage where I restore antique furniture and donate the profits to organizations that help victims of financial elder abuse. Last month, we took a cruise to Alaska, something I had dreamed of doing for 30 years but never could afford, while supporting Margaret and Sarah's expensive tastes. Elena and I stood on the deck, watching whales breach in the distance, and I realized I had never felt more grateful for anything in my life. Margaret and Sarah still live in the same town, where their betrayal made them pariahs. I hear occasional updates through mutual acquaintances who feel compelled to share their continuing struggles. Sarah works at a fast food restaurant and lives with 2 roommates in a cramped apartment. Margaret never found another job that paid more than minimum wage and drives a 15-year-old car that breaks down regularly. David Morrison apparently returned to town briefly last year, hoping to reconnect with Sarah. But she refused to see him. Even she finally understood that the man who had convinced her to destroy her relationship with me had nothing to offer except broken promises and empty dreams. They could have had everything: love, security, family, support through every challenge life might bring. Instead, they chose greed over gratitude, conspiracy over loyalty, betrayal over appreciation. Their loss became my freedom. Elena and I are planning a trip to Ireland next spring, where we'll spend 3 weeks driving the countryside and staying in bed and breakfasts that cater to people who have time to enjoy life instead of working themselves to death for ungrateful relatives. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. Sometimes justice means walking away from people who never deserved your love in the first place. Sometimes freedom costs everything you thought you wanted and turns out to be worth twice that much. Peace, I've learned, is better than family who sell you out. And happiness is possible even after the deepest betrayal, when you finally choose to live for yourself instead of for people who see your heart as something to exploit. That's a lesson worth $47,400. Every penny. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing.